entitled Stability of the Liberal Order, Moral Learning, and Constitutional Choice, an Unresolved Tension in James Buchanan's Political Economy. What we do in this paper is we look at what we think is a core issue in Buchanan's political economy, that he on the one hand advocates for a constitutional attitude, which is basically a sense of responsibility on behalf of citizens to engage in constitutional choice, in rulemaking, both at the individual level, he calls it the private man, and the social level, which is the public man. He's advocating for that, and he sees clearly the need for that, for the stability of a liberal order. But on the other hand, he doesn't really discuss what exactly it is, and he doesn't really discuss the institutional prerequisites for that. And what we think is that a neo-Aristotelian account of moral learning gives a framework to flesh out this tension and to answer with a productive solution.
Yeah, so regarding the neo-Aristotelian approach, what we try to emphasize basically is that a neo-Aristotelian account, broadly understood, I mean, there are many branches of neo-Aristotelian political theory, but broadly understood, it allows us to explain the mechanisms that, I mean, motivate people to develop certain character traits that allow them to engage in constitutional deliberation. It doesn't rule out that people will, on some occasions, act upon self-interest, but it does allow for extra individual motivation. And that's precisely what Buchanan is after.
Now, what we do towards the end of the paper is to say what are actually now not just philosophical problems to solve here, but also what are institutional implications. And what we're advocating for is, based on a neo-Aristotelian account, to look at recent empirical literature on moral/democratic learning. And we identify two causal channels for that type of learning, that sort of informal political discussion and formal political participation. What that means is, when you look into the empirical literature, what you see is that basically Tocqueville was right, that the participation in rulemaking ultimately inculcates habits of a civil society and the democratic habits that are necessary for the liberal order to be stable. So that is, I think, in a nutshell, what we do in this paper. And we're obviously very open to critique and to feedback from the community. We think that there is at least two ways how this paper is connected to a larger debate. The first one is connected to an issue in public choice. So public choice is famous for the introduction of self-interest in the analysis of politics, right? That we should do politics without romance and assume that there's a behavioral symmetry between, on the one hand, market actors that are self-interested, but also politicians and political actors. And that is an important contribution of people like Buchanan, but also Tulloch and others who wrote in that tradition. But at the same time, we think that this whole literature, and including economists more generally when they talk about politics, often underestimate the reflexivity between rules and individual agency or the individual actors. And what we mean by that is that rules are not just regulatory, right? That they change relative prices, but they ultimately are constitutive, that they ultimately shape the identity and the self-perceptions of the actors acting under those rules. And there's a recent literature both in behavioral economics, but also in moral psychology that taps into that. And Sean Hargreaves-Heap, for example, in the UK, is a person who has written on that and has done experiments on that. So that's one part. But I also think there are interesting implications for the philosophical literature, the larger philosophical literature on neo-Aristotelianism.
Oh, definitely. That's the other big kind of point of conversation of the paper with current research. And in particular, there's an old question in political theory regarding the conditions for the stability of an open or liberal order. And the worry is, I mean, related to what Malte was saying, what's being done in behavioral economics and moral psychology. There's an underlying question, which is basically that institutions designed assuming that individuals will act upon self-interest might undermine certain other moral motivations that are actually at the base of the stability of liberal societies. So it's basically the old tale of a snake biting its own tail, right? So what are the conditions and what are the character traits that individuals should kind of develop at the individual level for the stability of a liberal order? And the other thing is that on top of that, it's not only that individuals focus on developing character traits personally, but we definitely allow this reflexivity that Malte was mentioning between social institutions and individual action. So the causality goes both ways there. So current rules influence behavior, and current behavior influence current rules. So that kind of reflexivity is a very important topic in political theory, and we try to kind of talk to that part of the literature in the paper.
Started a project on a literature that is related to this paper, and this literature is actually a literature in behavioral welfare economics. Now, behavioral welfare economics is the idea that you take insights coming out of behavioral economics seriously, that people have massive preferences, that they're shaped by the environment they're in, that situational framing matters, etc. Basically take this literature and see that, well, preferences are often endogenous to the situation people are in, but then ask the normative question, well, what does that actually mean in terms of institutional design and maybe the conceptualization of welfare? And the big question in this context is, how can you conceptualize welfare, especially in the economic discourse, when preferences change? And what Matthias and I, are arguing for and started to think about is that even if it's true that a subset of our preferences is changing, there might be still a relative stability of a core of preferences that can be taken as an indicator for welfare. So do you want to expand on that, Matthias?
Yeah, of course. So the question is relevant for both normative and for metaphysical or ontological reasons, right? So what we're trying to, as Malte was saying, we're trying to find if there's any kind of benchmark against which you can judge welfare. And usually with the literature from behavioral economics, what it comes out of that for most people, or most people infer from that since preferences are constantly changing, there aren't kind of stable desires in individuals. So this translates into a philosophical problem about our identity and about some core desires that are unchanging, if you like. They can take many instantiations of different forms, but they belong to some core of our desires and preferences. And if we can, we're trying to elaborate on a philosophical account of desires that allows us to say, well, there is a stable core of preferences, even though those core preferences might take on different forms in particular subjects, times, and places. No, so that's kind of the more ontological part of personal identity of the problem.
And what we think is, maybe on a more meta level, the point here is that really that dialogue between philosophy on the one hand and economics on the other hand is very fruitful for those puzzling questions that come out of an empirical literature, but to make sense and put order on them and to advocate maybe for a normative framework that ultimately can also inform policy questions and policy design.